The information flow is endless, and with so many sensational headlines, changing policies, and market fluctuations, it can be tough to keep up with what's most relevant to you as a real estate investor. In Boardroom Brief, we endeavor to discuss and provide our point of view and insights on relevant topics that matter to Greybrook, our investors, and the broader real estate community. Our goal is to provide you with expert opinions in 20 minutes or less.
Sasha, welcome back to Boardroom Brief.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
A little bit of a break. Summer's now behind us. Favorite summer memory? Give it to me.
Ooh, favorite summer memory. My family and I went to see, somebody was courteous enough to give us tickets to see the National Bank Open, the tennis.
Oh, nice.
And we sat kind of right behind the baseline or whatever, and it was just an amazing experience. So seeing that was really cool.
Really nice, yeah.
It was fun.
Yeah, racket sports up close, I feel like.
What are yours?
If I had to pick one,
You had a lot. Good summer.
Yeah, it was a great summer. My 4-year-old is like a speed demon, and we went to a little theme park called Santa's Village.
In the summer.
In Gravenhurst. Yeah, I know.
Perfect.
And they have like a real roller coaster for little kids. So her and I sat front row on this thing called the Yeti, and she was just losing her mind. She was having a blast. So that was fun to watch.
Okay, good to know. It's a year-round Santa's Village.
It's a year-round Santa's Village. It's actually a theme park in Gravenhurst. Not a sponsored post. All right, everyone's back to work, including Parliament.
Yes.
Okay, so they're coming out the gate with a big announcement. The new agency they're launching, which is called Build Canada Homes. Mm-hmm. Okay, they're allocating $13 billion with a B to the promise of speeding up construction, building more homes, essentially doing the work that was part of their election platform. We don't have the full framework yet. The details haven't been released. But the general thesis is that this is the agency that's going to fix the housing crisis, okay? Is this direct government intervention the lever that you think will unlock housing supply? Or should the focus be more on essentially opening up and empowering the private sector?
I think, okay, so the first thing I'll say is I don't think a lot of the details are clear.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. So it's hard to, give a definitive opinion, but I am, close-ish to what's happening and getting some feedback here and there. And my understanding is that it's not one or the other. I mean, I think the organization's mandate will be partially to build, like to take the role of a builder, but the focus will be primarily on a category of housing in the affordable housing category, which is something that historically the private sector has not been able to do particularly well.
Sure.
Because, costs and profit margins, I mean, there are commercial realities to development, as you know, and sometimes it's very difficult to do. So they're attempting to take that over to a degree using some of the things that they have, land and some capital and capability. I think that the rest of the program, by and large, will allocate capital. Still unclear as to exactly where and exactly how, but I think the intention is to empower the private sector. I don't think it's to replace the private sector. I think it's to aim capital in places where the private sector can potentially use it effectively, whether that be through innovations like prefabricated housing and things like that, whether that be through capital solutions, different ways to try and achieve that. So I do think it's a bit of a partnership in that regard, at least my perception of it. Again, how it plays out, don't know yet, but it's a good step forward. And I'm typically not the type of person who wants more regulation or government intervention. I don't see this as regulation. Okay. I see this as an attempt to mobilize resources to try and solve a problem. So that can't be a bad thing in any way, as long as there's a willingness to listen. And so far, from what I've seen, there has been a willingness to listen on the part of both the Prime Minister at that level and everything below that, where they're engaging with the private sector in certain forum, right? Not so much these open letters and things like that. Maybe they are. But I do think there's an openness for dialogue, and that's a really positive thing, right? So if you're going to listen and you're willing to allocate resources and you've identified the problem, I think that there's space there to come up with a solution that works, in a public-private type partnership.
Sure. And I think in the past, you and I have spoken about some policies that are being put forward have traditionally focused on the demand side, right? How do we fix the demand side, make it easier for the demand side? This seems like something that's actually moving forward to try to fix the supply side. So I think that's a refreshing tone to take.
Yeah.
So within that kind of framework that you just discussed, there's kind of multiple hats that the government could wear. In your opinion, what's the most effective? Like, should they take on the role of financier, land assembler, just stick in the lane of regulator? Where do you think they're most effective?
I think, part of the issue I think we face as an industry is market forces have disrupted the feasibility of projects, right? And one way to improve the feasibility, obviously, we don't control, that being those same market forces, right? Supply, demand, factors, presence of investor capital, different things like that. Another way is to try to look at regulation and capitalization. So regulation being, approval timelines, things that the government has in their direct control. When I say government, we're talking about the federal government.
Yes.
It's not that simple because, there's, for example, development charges and things like that are municipal, and the feds really don't have a lot of control there. They can come up with other things to try and induce cities to lower their development charges, trade-offs that they can make as between the different levels of government. So I think that that's a place that they should focus. Yeah. And I think that they can make a lot of progress there if they can get it right. And I do think also that there are potentially capital solutions that the private sector might be willing to accept that might make a lot of sense for the government to achieve their goals, more housing, and also a catalyst to the industry. And I always think about, in the financial crisis, particularly in the US, where you had TARP, right? So
sure,
you had the Troubled Asset Relief Program, where the government came in and made investments in auto industry, in other parts of the economy that required stabilization. And they were all systemically important parts of the economy. So that stabilization then led to, survive and thrive, right? And I think you can think about the housing industry as the same way, because the housing industry is very stagnant at the moment. We have a need for housing. We're not achieving that need for housing. You have a whole industry that's relatively idle today by historical standards. So maybe there's a space where, you can make targeted investments that can help the industry as a catalyst, but then help it thrive going forward. And I think that those are the two areas, so regulation and potentially investment in some form.
And I mean, you mentioned the capital side. So with the government sort of playing a role in the realm of capital, do you think that could potentially crowd out private capital, or does this serve as something that can be complementary?
I don't think it crowds it out. I think it's definitely, to the extent it's deployed in that fashion, which again, I don't know. But if they did go down that path, I think it's a complement. Because typically, I feel like they're trying to solve for areas that private capital doesn't have a solution, or at least a commercially reasonable solution, right? So I think that they would be very complementary in nature. And I think the amount of capital that the industry requires to be, for the next 10, 15, 20 years is many exponents more than what the government could and should allocate.
Sure.
So I do think it's more of a situational, temporary solution that's very targeted, and that can help the private sector then take over. And so I do think it's more complementary.
And you brought up TARP as I think an interesting precedent. When this type of initiative happens with the government, and they're essentially almost providing like a stimulus package, right, into a specific industry. Do you think that stimulus, do you think that activity could potentially trigger or restore confidence in a market like, let's say, the pre-construction market that's been a bit stagnant right now?
Yeah, unequivocally. Like I'm going to use an example, and this, the intent isn't to get political in a polarizing way about a guy like Donald Trump, but it's always a lightning rod topic. But he did do one thing specifically that I think illustrates a situation where, Intel as a chip maker, a lot of trouble, right? It was a big semiconductor company, American. It needed help. right? It was spiraling toward bankruptcy and not really achieving the goals that it wants and its shareholders want. The government comes in, takes a stake in it. That government investment induces others to say, okay, well, you know what's going to happen here is that clearly they have the backing of the government. They're making a concerted effort to try to help this company. And then SoftBank makes an investment, and then Apple makes an investment. And now Intel's a very well capitalized company on its way to not only stability, but to potentially grow and thrive and become an industry leader. How it plays out, I don't know, right? And it's not that. It's about how a government entity chose to look at an industry and decided to make an investment in that industry, in this case, particularly a company,
Sure.
but an industry that then increased confidence amongst investors, it increased confidence amongst customers, and I think that the government can play a real important role in doing that and showing that, you know, housing as an industry is very important to Canada, and that the government has prioritized it as high as any other main priority that they have, I think would go a long way in restoring confidence in how people see the market. And I'm a big believer in the fundamentals of our real estate market here in Canada. I talk about it all the time. We're at a point in time where part of the reason the market is as stagnant as it is, there are real fundamental things, right? Interest rates, costs, things like that. But then there's also a crisis of confidence.
Yes.
And I think once we turn that corner, we are bound to see improvements that will then start to solve some of these other issues, right? And I think that the government is pretty well positioned to play a role.
Yeah, I think around the confidence side, you know, I used to look at at least the GTA market, right, as this market that's, you know, as you look at the data, as you look at the analysis, it was almost like shifting a tanker. It's like, okay, slowly you start to see it creep up. I think in the last, you know, probably decade or so, it's like a speedboat, right? As the confidence comes back, it's like opening the floodgates. And I think things like, you know, government intervention or stimulus, whatever we want to call it, could potentially trigger that speedboat to start going in the right direction.
Yeah, that's a great analogy, and I agree with it. I think, you know, one thing I want to make clear, in my career, you know, I've been around, I guess, a little over 20 years doing this, and more than ever before, is there consensus on what the issues are? And I think more than ever before, there's constructive dialogue between the private sector and the public sector about how to solve those problems, right? And I think that's true for all levels, I think. But I do think that the federal government is taking a leadership role by being very vocal about how they are prioritizing housing. Maybe we don't all agree, and sometimes when you read things in the news, they sort of evoke a visceral reaction. So when the government says, we're getting into the housing
Sure.
building development industry, the private sector right away are like, oh, what a terrible idea, you should just leave it to the private sector. But then when you get into the weeds of what they're actually trying to accomplish, like they're not setting up a developer to go build things. They're
Sure.
trying to find gaps in the current solutions that are out there in the private sector and either fill those gaps or figure out how to support so that they can fill the gaps, right? So either way, I think that's a pretty good approach, and I have to give credit to the feds for thinking about it that way. Maybe that's a function of, you know, Prime Minister Carney and his background being, you know, real estate, private sector, things like that. I think that probably helps, but I'm encouraged so far.
Yeah, I think, you know, again, the full framework hasn't been published, right? So some of what we're talking about is speculative, but I think when you look at it, it's almost like they're playing air traffic control, right? In the sense, okay, we have all of these levers we got to pull. We have private sector, you have demand from the front lines. How do we control it all? And you mentioned in one of your comments that there's obviously different levels of government, right? It's not completely in the federal government's power to just fix this problem. You have the municipal side and the provincial side. How do you think an agency like this can sort of help in making it kind of a kumbaya environment for everybody so that there's synergies between the three levels, and, you know, the federal government obviously plays a role in that?
Yeah, I guess a first step was the person that they hired to lead the organization, Anna Bailau, was a counselor, and then the deputy mayor, and then sort of moved into the private sector. So I think she probably has a pretty good handle on municipal politics and the mechanics and,
Sure.
and how things work. and I think probably some pretty decent relationships. And I can only speak for Toronto, but between, the housing minister being a former mayor of Vancouver, between, Anna Bailau being a former councillor and deputy mayor of Toronto, I think there's a pretty good understanding of municipal politics and understanding what levers there are to pull. So I think, I can't speak for this because I don't know, but I got to think there was some strategy in how they made these appointments or hires, and that was probably part of it, because there has to be a harmony between the federal government, the provincial government, and
Sure.
the city. And I think Premier Ford in Ontario has a pretty good relationship with the Prime Minister, so I think there'll be probably coordination and cooperation, and then further, at least in Ontario, and then further with Build Canada Housing CEO. So I think that was probably done on purpose, if you're asking me. The one other thing I just wanted to, you asked the question about private capital. If you just take certain components of Build Canada Housing and look at only that, but there are other things that have been discussed, like MERB, for example, bringing back MERB. Again, details are pretty scant at the moment, but that is specifically to try to mobilize private capital. So it's not a question of like crowding out private capital.
Yeah.
It's like, how can we make private capital want to do this more? How can we bring more capital to the equation? So I think it's pretty clear, at least in my mind, that the intention is not to be a replacement, but rather an augmentation, and that's what we need right now in the industry.
Yeah, it's like you mentioned, they can use tactics to induce municipalities. They could also do tactics to induce private investment, right?
Of course.
I'll leave you this one question is, you've been hired as the premier consultant to the Prime Minister for fixing this problem. What do you think is the single biggest unlock that they have in their power to help fix the housing crisis?
That's a great question. Without being too detailed at the moment, I think it's a capital solution. Like right now, I think there's a couple of things that we need to solve, and one of them is a particularly troubled sector of housing, which is the condo market in big cities. And I think that there's an opportunity today, looking at things that are positioned to be condos, and rather than waiting for these condo projects to be, for market forces to get back in line, which could happen soon, it could
Sure.
happen down the road, I don't know, but in the meantime, is there a solution that can help some of these projects achieve economic feasibility as rental buildings or different rental buildings that have different unit mixes and things like that? So can you solve the problem to have both the type of housing that we need as a country, the format of housing we need as a country, but make it economically feasible for the people who are tasked to do it? I think that there's a solution there that might work, and if it were me and I was sitting in the room today and you were Mark Carney and not Alex, that's where I would probably aim.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer, because as we look at kind of the front lines and a lot of the headlines, and I think you're touching on the fact that obviously there's certain subsegments of the market that need more help than others. No one is disagreeing with the fact that there's still a shortage of housing, right? Despite all of this, there's still that consensus, right? The housing shortage still exists. So how do you get creative from a policy perspective to look at the assets that are already in play, look at the private developers that are already in play, and make it all work?
And it's a big part of the economy too. Like I think we talk about housing very specifically, right? But as we think about Canada, broadly speaking, and how we care about our growth and prosperity as a country, and we keep talking about how do we increase, our own self-reliance, what kind of things can we do? Well, one component of the revenue line that is a big, our revenue line being GDP, that's a big component of it is construction and real estate. I mean, like it's about attracting, and right now with the market in the condition it is, creating a catalyst that gets that machine going again, I think is an increasingly important part. Heading into this sort of little lull in the market, we were having the opposite problem, which is like everything was there was so much activity, but there was a shortage of people, right? A shortage of infrastructure.
Yeah.
Well, we're only making that worse today, right? Because eventually if people aren't able to get work or they're not busy enough or whatever, they're gonna look elsewhere, maybe out of province, maybe out of country. And I think that the sooner we can get that going, the better. So it's not just an immediate impact on housing, it's an impact that I think is a positive impact across the economy as a whole.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting sort of wait and see as they release the details and as we get into all the sort of fine print of how this is going to work and where does the private sector get involved. Thanks, Sasha. Appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.